French Revolution. And well, last week we began to discuss how the French Revolution changed politics in Europe forever. And before the French Revolution, you had in Europe what was commonly or became known as the old regime. And that would, when we talk about conservatism, in this context, we're talking about people who believed in the old way, the divine right of kings, the absolutism that we examined going back to the 17th and 18th centuries. That was, when you talk about conservatism in the 19th century, 18th century, that's what it meant to be a conservative, somebody who believed in the old ways, believed in the principles that we discussed that come under the heading, the old regime, in this column on your left. What came out of the French Revolution and the American Revolution was this idea, this new way of looking at government, which is known as liberalism. And when we talk about a liberal in the course of this discussion, we're talking about people who believe in the principles of the American and French Revolution. This would become the principles that you can see on your right, on the right column. And the French Revolution really established this concept of liberalism across Europe. Now, Napoleon, even though he was a dictator and somewhat of a brutal dictator, he came to symbolize for many the spirit of the French Revolution, the principles of liberalism. And which is kind of ironic, isn't it? But nonetheless, his defeat, which we're going to look at today, by the conservative powers of Europe, the defeat of Napoleon and his overthrow brought to an end almost nearly 2 decades of war and revolution that had swept across Europe. Now, even though Napoleon was defeated and the French monarchy was restored, the Bourbons dynasty was restored to rule in France, even though all that happened, the ideas of the French Revolution continued to inspire millions. And there was this kind of love and excitement about the principles of liberalism. And in the early 19th century, liberalism was closely linked to nationalism. So people who shared a common language and culture, whether they be French or German or English or Spanish or Italian, they all kind of felt this love for nation, love for their own people. And that love of their nation, love of their people, that kind of extreme patriotism was linked very strongly in this period to the ideals of liberalism. So in the early 19th century, the same people who wanted to see liberal government, elections and representative assemblies and written constitutions, those same people also wanted to see all the people who share a common language and culture united by a single government. So they were nationalists and they were liberals all rolled into one. And that was part of the legacy of the French Revolution and the age of Napoleon. So what we see in the course of the first half of the 19th century are these successive waves of revolution. One happened in 1820, another happened around 1830, and then the mother of all waves of revolution swept across Europe in 1848. So over the next couple of lessons, lectures, we're going to be looking at these waves of revolution that swept across Europe after the French Revolution for the first half of the 19th century. All right. Now, what I wanted to do before we start looking at Napoleon in the 19th century, I wanted to go over some concepts that weren't really covered in the video, but I think that are important. It's important to remember that the French Revolution, the video seems to suggest that the French Revolution was just caused by the fact that the vast majority of the French people were in poverty and poor and desperate. And that's true. There's no doubt about that. The video isn't incorrect about that. But I hope you're all smart enough and have picked up on the fact that when you study history, you realize that it's never that simple. There's always multiple causes involved in any major historical event. And the French Revolution is definitely one of those. Like, there are a number of different principles or causes behind the French Revolution. One of them was an idea, the Enlightenment. We've discussed the Enlightenment already in this class. And the Enlightenment, remember, was all about how to make the world more rational, how to advance the human condition. And intellectuals across Europe, and in France in particular, remember France was the home of the Enlightenment, the land of Voltaire. In France, intellectuals could look at their system, look at the political system that they possessed, and look at it as inefficient, as corrupt, as irrational, and hope to build and create something better. Now, not all Enlightenment figures were revolutionaries, most weren't, but they still, their idea of advancing the human condition through change and through progress, that was a factor in inspiring some of the real revolutionaries of the French Revolution. Like Robespierre was a man of the Enlightenment by any measure. I'm sure you've heard about him or read about him. Another factor was that another big factor behind the French Revolution was that you had in France and across Europe this emerging and growing middle class. You know, the middle class, because of the market revolution, the numbers and wealth of the middle class continued to rise and grow exponentially, to really expand. And under the old regime, if you were middle class, you were still classed as a commoner. You had no power at all. You were just you were no better than a peasant in the eyes of the system, in the eyes of tradition. Only aristocrats had a monopoly on political power in the old regime. And so many members of the middle class welcomed revolution as a way of giving themselves a voice, giving themselves a say. You know, they already had economic power. They wanted political power to match their economic strength. So the rise of the middle class really fueled these revolutions, not only the French Revolution, but the revolutions into the 19th century. They were the ones who were out of the loop under the old system, and they wanted the ability to have a voice and to have political power. And finally, and not finally, but another factor in the French Revolution was the American Revolution. The two were linked together, and we're going to look at that in a minute. And finally, what really started the series of events that led to the collapse of the monarchy and the French Revolution was the fact that France was a financial mess. Not only did you have poor and desperate people, but the French government, through poor governance and bad taxation policies, was broke. They had a huge debt. For years of war, they had paid for their wars, paid for their expensive court through borrowing money, and they were in debt, and they owed millions, and what would today be the equivalent of millions and billions of dollars. They were in debt, and they had a tax system that did not allow them to pay off those debts. And under the old regime in France, aristocrats and the church paid no taxes. And they were the wealthiest landowners. So the wealthiest people were paying the least amount of taxes, and the tax burden was falling on the middle class and the poor. And they were the ones, the poor in particular, were really poor. So it wasn't just about desperation and poverty. It was a multitude of factors. Now, the ideas of the American Revolution really influenced the French Revolution. Now, the one reason why you don't hear a lot about the American Revolution as being quite as revolutionary as the French Revolution is because the American Revolution wasn't that revolutionary, in the sense that it did not fundamentally change American society. You see, the French Revolution just completely changed. It was a radical move in the direction of society. I mean, and in the case of the American Revolution, that was not quite the case. You see, in America, since the foundation of the British colonies in America you had widespread land ownership. Now, they had to kill a lot of Indians and force them off the land to get that land. But the fact of the matter is that in America, in the 18th century, even before the American Revolution, you had as many as 2/3 to 3/4 of the population owning their own property. Now, according to the traditions of English government, remember, if you own property, you could vote and you could hold office. Now, in England, where only like less than 10% of the population owned property, that meant that only the aristocracy and the very wealthy commoners could vote and hold office and run for parliament. But in the colonies, where you had more than half, 3/4 of the population owning property, every one of those persons, those men anyway, adult males who owned property, could vote. And they did vote. And they had, every colony had its own elected legislature, which in many ways was a mini-me of the English Parliament. It was like a smaller version of the English Parliament. So in the colonies, you had a tradition of people voting and holding office and running for government. And the colonies also enjoyed, up until 1763 anyway, they also enjoyed pretty much autonomy. The government of England did not really take much of an interest in the affairs of the colony. So the colonial legislatures pretty much had the run of the ship. They pretty much enjoyed autonomy and freedom of movement, and they could do whatever they wanted. So the American colonists were used to being locally governed, and when it came to the issue of taxes, they decided what taxes they would pay. It was only the locally elected legislatures that made laws and imposed taxes on the people who elected them to hold office. Also in America, you didn't have the extremes of rich and poor that you had in Europe. Because so many people owned land, you had a kind of a rough, egalitarian spirit. You know, in England, the yeoman common farmer who owned his own property was an anomaly. It was the exception to the rule. But in America, you had yeoman farmers, you had landowning common farmers everywhere. And they had this kind of sense of being equal. So you had this kind of rough sense of equality among the Americans because of the fact that they shared kind of many of them shared a common lifestyle. They were farmers, they were family farmers, they ran for office, they elected people to the local legislature, and they enjoyed that kind of independence for many decades. Now, the big change came in 1763 after the 7 Years' War. King George III was the first English king in a long time to actually give a hoot about governing England. His grandfather and great-grandfather had been German speakers who had spent most of their time in Germany, didn't care too much for England. He was the first member of the House of Hanover who really wanted to be involved in government, and it was really a sad thing that he was terrible at it. He was a terrible king. Not that he was a bad person, he was just generally incompetent. But he hoped to work with Parliament. He wasn't an absolute king in any sense. He recognized the traditions of English government meant that he shared power with Parliament. But he appointed prime ministers who basically were incompetent. And what happened is that England felt that they could impose taxes on the colonists and use those taxes to pay off their debts. Remember, as a result of the 7 Years' War, Great Britain had acquired a huge empire, and we saw how they acquired an empire in India as well. But now it was time to pay off those debts. And most of those debts were owed to English citizens. Remember, they paid for their debt by borrowing from the Bank of England and from investors within England. But now it was time to pay off those debts. So they thought, George III and Parliament thought that they could just impose new taxes on the colonists, and the colonists would pay those taxes, and those taxes would cover this enormous debt. But what they did not expect was that the colonists were in no mood to pay these taxes. For the colonists, they came to believe that paying these taxes was a violation of their rights as Englishmen. Because from their point of view, they did not elect members of Parliament, so Parliament had really no authority to impose laws and taxes on them. They firmly believed that only their locally elected colonial legislatures had the authority to impose taxes and laws on them. And that was at the heart of the disagreement that arose. Now, eventually, this disagreement developed into a full-on war by 1775. And then when it became clear that George III and Parliament were not going to change their view, the colonists decided to take the next step and declare their independence. Now, before July 4th, 1776, before America declared its independence, and before Thomas Jefferson drafted the Declaration of Independence, he was asked by the Continental Congress to do so, a man by the name of Thomas Paine, who was an Englishman who had just recently immigrated to the colonies, he published a very influential pamphlet called Common Sense. And this pamphlet is very important because Thomas Paine came to speak. He became the voice of many Americans. You know, the Common Sense was by today's standards would be a huge bestseller. It sold hundreds of thousands of copies, and it was read not only in America but across Europe. And it became, for Americans, Thomas Paine became the voice of the American Revolution. And it was a book that was written in very simple English so that any American could read it. The only kind of allusions that were made to any kind of literature in the book were to the Bible. Most Americans were Christians and had read the Bible and were familiar with its content. So when Thomas Paine, who by the way was a deist and not a Christian, he wrote the book because he knew that, and he used the Bible as a source because he knew that that was a book that Americans were familiar with and could understand and find commonality with. So in this book, in this pamphlet, this brief pamphlet, what he did was articulated the ideals of what it meant to be a republic, the idea of equality for all citizens, the idea of having elected leaders rather than hereditary kings. And he basically came to, and through arguments, argued that it was actually monarchy that was unbiblical and unchristian, and that God had given power to people, to the nation of Israel initially, to have their own government, that the people were the source of all authority and law, and they had the right to elect representatives and elect leaders to lead them in a republic. And so now this ideology, this was embraced by many Americans because it mirrored their own particular situation. In America, most Americans were farmers. Most Americans had a common lifestyle. And so the idea that they all should share equality before the law and that they should not have a hereditary monarch, these ideas really made sense to millions of Americans. And so many Americans came to identify themselves with the ancient republics, like of the city-states of Greece or the Roman Republic. That's why when eventually Washington, D.C. was constructed, its model and much of the architecture of Washington, D.C. was consciously built to imitate the glory that was the Roman Republic, because Americans, they came to identify themselves with the ancient Romans as being a republic. So the American Revolution was very revolutionary in setting forth a new kind of system of government. But this system of government was suited to the economic and social situation in America. See, America didn't have a aristocracy per se. It didn't have a landed aristocracy. The closest thing to it maybe were the planters who owned slaves in the South, but they did not have a landed gentry that monopolized political power like you did over in Europe. So this was America was a very different situation than in France, where you did have a landed aristocracy that owned so much wealth and was much more wealthier than any peasant, where you didn't have a yeoman class of any size like you did in America. Now, the ideas of the French Revolution, the ideas of the American Revolution came to an influence in France directly because France was actually an ally of the United States during the American Revolutionary War. France only made this alliance to get back at England for the earlier defeat of France in the 7 Years' War. So it wasn't about that the French actually had any kind of sympathy for the American cause, the French government anyway, but they saw an alliance with the United States as a way to punish Great Britain and get revenge for an earlier defeat. Now, as a result of this alliance, Benjamin Franklin, who was one of the foremost leaders of America, he was actually the ambassador sent by the United States to France. And Benjamin Franklin became a celebrity in France. And he came to, for many French, he came to symbolize what America was all about. You know, here was somebody, Ben Franklin was born poor. His father was a candle maker. Here was someone who, through hard work, had become a millionaire by today's standards, and he was a publisher, very successful. I mean, how many of us would like to retire at age 44? He retired at age 44, basically, by today's standards, a multi-millionaire. He was like the Bill Gates of his day. In terms, he built this publishing empire, and he also was somebody who was self-educated and an intellectual and a man of the Enlightenment. And for the French, he came to symbolize the potential of having a more open system of government that welcomed talent and ability from all classes and wasn't just run by fancy pants aristocrats. So the ideas of the French Revolution really came to inspire, the ideas of the American Revolution came to really inspire many Frenchmen. All right, so I just wanted to make it clear that there are many causes of the French Revolution, and one of them was one of the inspirations for the French Revolution was the American Revolution. All right, now you should probably notice that the French Revolution, from your video that you watched, went through a number of different phases, and we're not going to go off into details, but the first phase was to simply become a constitutional monarchy. That was the initial effort by the National Assembly, which became the Constituent Assembly, to create in France a constitutional monarchy. But Louis XVI and his wife Marie Antoinette, a Habsburg, were not on board with the idea of being a constitutional monarchy, and that created problems. And eventually, when it became clear that both Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were in cahoots with foreign governments trying to overthrow the government of France, that's when the monarchy was overthrown and France was declared a republic in 1792. Now, France was a radical republic, and that's from 1792 till 1794. That's the period of Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety, and the time all the executions were taking place with the guillotine. And Robespierre was essentially a dictator and running France. And it was at this time when France was facing foreign invasion and internal rebellions by conservative forces that there was this kind of new spirit of nationalism that galvanized and united the French. And this is where people began to see the power of nationalism, because when the French, remember, the French had been a second-rate power during the whole 18th century. They had been gone downhill after Louis XIV. So the 18th century, France was considered a second-rate power. But all of a sudden, in 1793, when all the great powers of Europe are against them, the French somehow managed to defeat simultaneously all the great powers of Europe. And that's when other people begin to take notice and say, look, this nationalism, this spirit that unites the people is a powerful force. It just galvanizes and makes people strong. And now it was in this revolutionary fervor that France wrote what still continues to this day to be its national anthem, the Marseillaise. And the Marseillaise march, the Marseillaise anthem is about war. It's a very inspirational, if you're French anyway, song. It also was the inspiration behind the communist movement. I mean, Marx would always like to sing the Marseillaise because it's about people uniting to overthrow oppressors and tyranny and just kicking their ass and killing them all. Now, I want to play the Marseillaise, and you can hear the music and listen and see the lyrics, and just take note of the lyrics. Hopefully this will work. Hopefully we're on our sound. I don't know if we are or not. All right. Well, maybe not. Well, C. Oh, maybe. LC is the sound works. Kill people who are enemies, people of impure blood. Yes?
Did you do a great job when Hitler gallivanting across Europe?
Oh, wait, stop. What? Somebody had said something, I didn't hear you. Oh, oop.
Yeah, it said the PowerPoint quit working, so.
Oh, that's all right, I'll get it up again.
Did you watch Les Miserables when it was in theaters? And I never realized that before.
Yeah, well, you see, you gotta imagine that Les Miserables, not Les Miserables, but Marseille's song. Imagine you're with like 100,000 people, and you're all common purpose, and you're all singing that song. See how that would be inspirational? That would get you going, that would get your blood pouring, get you ready to fight, get you ready for battle. That's why they always used to sing during the Russian Revolution. Lenin would get all the Russians, they would sing that song because that's the song of. It was the song of the French Revolution, but it became the song of revolution in general. Like if you want to go out and inspire people to fight against the enemy and destroy tyranny, then that's the song we sing. But it's a revolutionary song. All right, so let's go to that. All right, so we talked about now. So you had this radical phase. Now remember, Robespierre though kind of got a little power hungry and killed a lot of people. A lot of people were thrown in jail or executed at the orders of Robespierre. And eventually there was what became known as the Thermidor reaction, where people who were still believed in a republic but thought that Robespierre and his radicalism were too radical, they came to power, and Robespierre ended up actually being executed himself. It's a great story about Robespierre, though. Did you watch the video, right, about Robespierre? But when he found out that he had been declared an enemy of state, he tried to shoot himself, but he missed, and so he shot his jaw off. And then he tried to jump out a window and broke his legs. So he's a man with no jaw and his legs broken. This is what the French did. They tied a rope around his chin to keep his chin on, his jaw on. They hauled him into court with broken legs, did a full trial, condemned him for treason, and then guillotined him. So, that's not very funny, but, it's kind of funny. Because here's this guy who ordered all these executions, and it's kind of like Saddam Hussein. Remember the story about Saddam Hussein when he got hung? His head came off when they hung him because they didn't do it right. So instead of hanging, he was decapitated. And to the very end, he was surrounded by his enemies, like throwing stuff at him and cursing at him. That's what happens to tyrants. They usually get it. How about Mussolini? He was hung upside down and pelted with eggs and spit on after he was brutally executed. So, being a tyrant isn't all what it looks like. It's something that happens to you. But anyway, so you had a period after Robespierre was crushed and his revolution ended. You had a more reactionary republic. France was still a republic, but it was not quite as radical. And the Directory, that was the Constitution that was drafted by the National Convention, was a much more conservative document than maybe what Robespierre would have wanted. Under the Directory, for example, there was a property requirement to vote, so it basically excluded the poorest French from even participating in the political process. And that way it was much more conservative than the radical, all-male suffrage that Robespierre had wanted. Now the Directory, though, was a government that was surrounded by enemies. It was hounded on the left by more radical Republicans. It was hounded on the right by monarchists who wanted to restore the Bourbon monarchy. And it was also surrounded by hostile European nations, namely the Habsburgs of Austria. Remember, Marie Antoinette, who had been executed by the French, was a Habsburg. So the Habsburgs of Austria and England, Great Britain. Those were the two, would remain throughout the whole period as the two biggest enemies, along with Russia, of the French Republic. Now, Napoleon's rise to power can be seen in this context, in the sense that as the army, the Revolutionary Army, became the main defense of the French Republic. You know, here it was surrounded by enemies, so the French Republic relied on the army to keep it afloat, to fight off enemies abroad and keep enemies within under wraps. And it was in that context that Napoleon, as the most courageous and intelligent and brilliant commander that he was, that he emerged as the dominant force in France. Now, eventually, in 1799, when France was on the verge of being invaded by Habsburg, Russian, and British forces, he did the coup d'etat. He overthrew the Directory and basically made himself dictator. And for the rest of his life, Napoleon would rule as essentially a military dictator, a man who ruled by virtue of the fact that he had the loyalty of the army, just like Cromwell during the English Civil War. Now, and as you can see, under Napoleon, if you look at this map, all what you see in blue on this map are lands that are either under direct French control or forced to be allies of the French. So you can see that during Napoleon's heyday, he controlled more than 2/3 of Europe. So he was by far the most powerful man in all of Europe during his heyday. Really, this would be his heyday was between around 1807 and 1810. So look at this map. You know, look, everything you see in blue, that's where lands controlled by Napoleon. So he really was a very powerful man, not only in France, but in all of Europe at his height. Now, the thing about Napoleon is that he's a very controversial figure, even to this day. You know, for some, he's a hero, because many people see, some historians would say that Napoleon kind of saved the French Republic. He not only preserved the ideals of the French Revolution, but he introduced these ideals to other parts of Europe. Any nation that was under the control of France and Napoleon's armies, all those countries were reformed, their governments were reformed along the lines of the French Revolution. For example, Napoleon, one of his great achievements as ruler of France was that he codified French law. It's called the Napoleonic Code. And the Napoleonic Code was based on the principles of the French Revolution: liberty, equality, and fraternity. Those were that was the great slogan of the French Revolution. For example, in the Napoleonic Code, there's no privileges. Everybody's equal under the law. And that was a very strong, radical principle of liberalism, the idea that there are no special privileges for the elite. Everybody under the law is equal. Equality under the law. And it also established a written system of laws. That was also another liberal idea, that you need to have a system of laws and a constitution that's clear, transparent, and available for anybody to access and read. And that's what the Napoleonic Code did. So in that sense, you can see that he was a hero of the French Revolution and the ideas of liberalism. And every country that was conquered by the French came under this new system of law code. So in this way, the principles of the French Revolution were imposed, in some cases against the people's will, on these new areas. So the ideas of the French Revolution were introduced and propagated across Europe due to Napoleon's conquering armies and his victories. Now, you can also see in Napoleon, another side of him was he was a very vain and almost megalomaniac person. He really loved celebrating Napoleon. He was very proud of himself. And he did everything he could to advance his own family, himself and his family. So as we'll see, he placed many members of his family on the thrones of Europe. So in many ways, he wasn't all that much different than the Habsburgs or the Bourbons or the great European ruling dynasties. In many ways, he was a throwback in the sense that he was trying to establish a new dynasty to run Europe. And another negative aspect of Napoleon was that he set up a system of government that nominally preserved principles of liberalism, but basically allowed him to hold on to power. Now, for example, in 1800, he did write a constitution, and under this constitution, he was consul. He held supreme power. He had the authority. He was the chief executive, and he also now eventually he decided. Now, in the original constitution that he drew up in 1800, he gave himself a 10-year term as consul. But then in 1802, he would amend the Constitution to make himself consul for life. So he would always be consul. And then in 1804, he amended the Constitution again at his will and declared himself emperor. And he even brought in the Pope to crown him as emperor of the France. And when he did so, there's a great story. I don't know if it was planned or just something he did on the spur of the moment, but when the Pope came to crown him, just at the moment when the Pope was to place the throne on his head, he grabbed the crown and placed it on his own head. And observers said he did that because he wanted to make it known to the world that he was making himself the emperor, not the Pope, that he owed nothing to nobody. But anyway, so he basically was ruler. Now, he did set up a system. There was a representative government. The way it worked under the Constitution that he drew up was that all males could vote. So everybody in France, all adult males could vote. But you didn't actually elect people to the legislature. You elected electors. So when you voted, when the French people voted, they would elect an elector. And to be an elector, you had to be very well off. And you also had to be supportive of Napoleon. There were about 70,000 electors. And most of them were landowners and doctors and lawyers and wealthy businessmen. But they were the electors were the ones who actually did the voting. And they would elect to a legislature that was made up of a House of Delegates, like a lower house, and then a Senate that was an upper house. But the thing about the legislature under Napoleon was that it couldn't initiate any new taxes or laws. All it could do was to vote yes or no on something that was presented to it by Napoleon. So in other words, basically it was like a dummy legislature. All Napoleon had to do was he would introduce a law, he would introduce a tax, and then the legislature could not debate it, it couldn't amend it, it couldn't do anything. All it could do was to vote yes or no on whatever Napoleon and his Council of State presented to it. So it really wasn't a full active legislature like we think of our own House of the House of Representatives or the Senate. Now the way, even the way that Napoleon controlled, he even controlled the elections to the legislature, because under the system that he set up, France was divided up into departments or provinces, and the chief executive of every department was a prefect, and these prefects were chosen by Napoleon. They weren't elected. They were chosen by Napoleon, for Napoleon, and they basically were his allies. And the prefect controlled the local police. Every department had a police force, and Napoleon used the police force to basically eliminate the competition. So the police force, of course, it maintained law and order like all police forces do, but another function of the police was to find out who were the troublemakers, who were the ones who might be potential opponents. And these individuals could be rounded up and put into exile or jailed or even executed because the prefects controlled the police, and the prefects were the political appointees of Napoleon. So he used the prefects and the police to kind of undermine and destroy any political opposition that might oppose him. And also what the prefects did was that they would post a list of candidates. And when you have the police saying, these are the people you need to vote for, and they all have guns, you're going to vote for those candidates. That's just the way it is. Now, so Napoleon, he established a system that on the appearance looked like a liberal system of government. You had elections, you had representative bodies, you had a written constitution, but the system was set up in such a way to ensure that only the supporters of Napoleon held any kind of political power. Now, another thing about Napoleon that's controversial is the issue of nationalism. You see, Napoleon inspired people for negative reasons. You see, the French, one thing that people looked at was that the French under Napoleon dominated Europe. So other European peoples were thinking to themselves, if we had a national state and if we had a liberal regime, then maybe we could attain to the military success that the French have. So the success of Napoleon inspired Germans and Italians to think, hey, the French were able to achieve great things by liberalism and nationalism, maybe we can too. Another way that Napoleon's France inspired nationalism was that the French were so arrogant and cocky and mean that everywhere they went, a lot of people said, you know what, I might not like my friend here, but he's a Spaniard like me, and we're both Spaniards, and we hate the French. Or, hey, I don't like this guy, but he's German, and I'm German, and we hate the French. So the hatred of the French kind of united Europeans of all stripes. So Germans were united by their hatred of Napoleon. The Spanish were united by their hatred of Napoleon. Everybody was united by their hatred of Napoleon. So he inspired people in a negative way. Because he inspired them in a negative way, but he also inspired them in a positive way, because they said, look, if Napoleon can take a second-rate country like France and make it into the greatest world power the world has seen, then maybe we can do the same thing with our country. So that's how Napoleon is such a controversial figure even to this day. That I don't think it's fair. If you look at Napoleon's record, I don't think it's fair to kind of compare him to Hitler, because he wasn't nearly that ruthless. But he wasn't any kind of nice guy either, if you look at his record. Now, the thing about Napoleon was that he, through diplomacy and his superior military strategy, he was able to achieve great success. For example, 1800, France is facing invasion by the Russians, by the Habsburgs, and by Great Britain. So what does he do? He divide and conquer. In 1800, he went to the Emperor of Russia, Paul I, and said, look, the British are really busy now with me. This would be a great time to invade India and expand into Central Asia, because the British are occupied with what's going on with me. And Paul was thinking, hey, that's a great idea. So Paul left the alliance. And then, so after he got the Russians to leave the alliance, the old divide and conquer strategy, he struck against the Habsburgs. The way to attack the Habsburgs was to go through, either you could go through southern Germany, or you could go through Italy. And in 1802, his forces occupied much of northern Italy. This was an area that was traditionally part of Habsburg Austria, part of the Habsburg Empire. And what he did there in 1803, he declared a Republic of Italy. The kind of constitution that he had set up in France, he set up in Italy. But guess who was the elected for life president of the French Republic? Napoleon. That's how he held on to power. Now he could do that because he was Italian. People don't know this about Napoleon. He was born on the island of Corsica, and he grew up speaking a dialect of Italian. So he had a good. He could say he was Italian, but when he was a teenager, he'd gone to school in France, and because Corsica would have been annexed by France in 1765. But anyway, so he was the president of Italy. Now these events in Europe had a big impact on events around the world. In about this time period, he had plans to resurrect the French Empire in the New World, and basically he, through diplomatic pressure and the threat of war, he got the Spanish government to sign over all this land in the New World that was claimed by Spain to France. And so all this big chunk of territory that stretches from Texas all the way to Canada, all in the midsection of what is the United States, was now part of France. And he even had plans to expand the port of New Orleans, and he tried to reestablish French control over Haiti, the big sugar island that was part of the French Empire in the Caribbean. And so he had big plans. He had plans to expand French influence in the New World. But then something happened. You see, what had happened is in 1801, Paul, the Emperor of Russia, he was assassinated. And many people think that he was a man who was part of the assassination was his own son, Alexander. Now, Alexander probably may have been involved in his father's assassination because he knew his father was crazy. Now, Paul, when Paul had, remember, he was the one who made the deal with Napoleon. Alexander was he was no slouch. He knew that Napoleon was a threat, and Napoleon got word that Alexander was plotting to resurrect a grand coalition against him, and so he knew that what was coming. Napoleon knew what was coming, so he decided that he had to take some steps to take care of his situation. Now, some things had happened with his plans for resurrecting the French Empire in the New World. First of all, in Haiti, things didn't go as planned. The slaves there, the black people who lived in Haiti, had no desire to be slaves of the French. They were inspired by the French Revolution. They didn't want to be slaves anymore. And the people of Haiti rose up in rebellion against the French. The French sent a huge force to try to crush this rebellion, and most of the French died of yellow fever. Or they died of fighting a guerrilla war against the Haitians. The Haitians went up into the hills of Haiti and fought a guerrilla war. And so things weren't looking good for Napoleon. So Napoleon decided, hey, I'm just going to forget this idea of building up an empire in the New World. I need money now. I need money fast because it looks like Alexander of Russia is coming out for me. So what he did is he approached the President of the United States, Thomas Jefferson, and he said, look, would you like a lot of land at a good price? It's called the Louisiana Purchase. And President Jefferson of the United States was like, yeah, cool, yeah. Whatever, $15 million for like a huge amount of land. It works out about 18 cents an acre. I'll take it. And he did. And so the result was that the United States doubled its size without fighting a war, just because of Napoleon. Napoleon needed some quick cash, gave him a good deal, wanted to cut his losses. He also just forgot about Haiti, just let Haiti go as well, and it became the second republic in the New World after the United States. So he cut his losses in the New World, got a little cash on the side with his deal with Thomas Jefferson, and then what he decided to do in 1804, 1805 was realizing that this coalition was plotting against him and was in the works. He decided that the best best defense is offense. So he decided to launch an attack against his enemies. So beginning in 1805, between 1805 and 1807, he won an amazing amount of victories. He won the battles of Ulm and Austerlitz in 1805, and the Habsburgs of Austria. He marched across southern Germany right toward Vienna, the capital of Habsburg Austria. And the Habsburgs were defeated very quickly, and they dropped out of the war. The Treaty of Pressburg, basically, in 1805, the Habsburgs were knocked out of the war and made peace with Napoleon. So he knocked out one. Now he had Prussia to the north and the Russians to the east. Of course, Great Britain as well. But they were on an island, so they were hard to get to. So this was the plan. So after he had defeated the Habsburgs, he marched into northern Germany, defeated the Prussian army at the Battle of Jena in 1806, and then he occupied Berlin and forced the Prussians out of the war. So after these slew of victories, he decided it was time to kind of rewrite the map of Europe. You know, he had won these great victories. So, for example, he decided, well, you know, now that I'm the Emperor of France, it didn't make any sense for me to be just the president of Italy. So he declared himself King of Italy. So now he's the Emperor of France, and he's the King of Italy. Now, Italy then was just northern and central Italy. So what he decided to do is he overthrew the Bourbon family in the south of Italy, in Naples, and put his brother Joe, little Joe, made him, his brother Joseph, the king of Naples. He also decided that the French had occupied the Netherlands since 1795. So he decided that the Netherlands needed to be a kingdom, not a republic anymore, not the Batavian Republic. But and so he had another brother of his named Louis, made King of Holland. So now he had one brother, King of Holland. He had another brother, King of Naples. And he decided, you know what, we already have an emperor, me. So we really don't need a Holy Roman Empire anymore. That doesn't make any sense. So he abolished the Holy Roman Empire, an institution that had been around for 1,000 years. He got rid of it. And he completely reorganized the German states. You know, Germany was divided up into literally hundreds and hundreds of states. And he basically kind of jammed a bunch of states together into a bunch of smaller states, and he called it the Confederation of the Rhine. Now, it was a confederation of states, and they all had a meeting, but you needed to have a president of the Confederation of the Rhine. Guess who was the president of the Confederation of the Rhine? Just take a wild guess. Napoleon, yeah. Yeah, he's the president of the Confederation of the Rhine. All right, so he's basically rewritten the map of Europe, eliminated a 1,000-year Holy Roman Empire into a much smaller configuration of states. In fact, some historians have argued that Napoleon did more to unify Germany than any German did, because he forced all these little German principalities into larger states. Well then, after he'd taken care of that, he decided it was time to march against Russia. So he marched against Russia, defeated them in Poland, and he knocked them out of the war. So in the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807, Austria was already out, but Prussia and Russia now signed an alliance with him. They were forced to become allies of him, and he decided it was time to make some more changes. And so what he decided to do was to take a bunch of land away from Prussia. He wanted to punish Prussia. A bunch of land in Prussia, and he took a bunch of little German states that had once existed, and he created a whole new kingdom, the Kingdom of Westphalia. Now he had another brother named Jerome. He's got Joseph, he's got Louis, he's got Joseph, he's got Louis, now he's got Jerome. So he makes his brother Jerome King of Westphalia. So he punishes Prussia by taking away a bunch of their territory and combining it with some other small German states to create a whole new kingdom in northern Germany for his younger brother Jerome, Jerry. You know, Jerry Bonaparte. Jerry, anyway. And then he decides to punish Russia by creating a duchy of Warsaw, which around Poland, and he makes one of his allies, the Duke of Saxony, the King of Saxony in Germany, the Duke of Warsaw. So he's basically rewritten the map of Europe and humiliated two of the great powers of Europe, the Prussians and the Russians. And now he was dominant. By after 1807 and the Treaty of Tilsit, only Great Britain, of all the powers of Europe, was his only enemy left out there. And so he was dominant. Now, Napoleon is very important because he, as a strategist, because basically he was such a great strategist that for 100 years, even up to World War I, military strategists studied what he had done. And his tactics were placed into textbooks where people learned, where generals and strategists went to school. And basically Napoleon was a great student of history. He learned from Wallenstein, he learned from Frederick the Great, he learned from Peter the Great, and he combined their strategies into a workable strategy. And if you ever study Civil War history, you know, if you look at what the Civil War generals were doing in the American Civil War, all their tactics and strategy were based on what the tactics that had worked for Napoleon. So you only fight battles when your soldiers have a full stomach. That was one of the principles. You wait to the key moment when you have the high ground and you can surround and destroy your enemy. You always occupy strategic cities where you can have a source of food and supplies. He realized, like Wallenstein, that an army marches on its stomach. You need to have well-fed, rested soldiers to win battles. And following those principles, he won almost every battle he fought. All right. Well, we've gone for quite a long time here. Why don't we take a little break here for a couple of minutes, and then we'll finish up Napoleon's story and get moving. All right. Now the thing about Napoleon was that what he was facing after his great victories in the continent was the fact that he still had a Great Britain that he was waging war against, and this Great Britain was not going to go down. They were resistant. They were not going to come to terms. And the problem with Great Britain is that they had a superior fleet, so that an outright invasion of Great Britain was out of the question because of the superiority of the British fleet. This had been proven. As in 1805, at the Battle of Trafalgar, off the coast of North Africa, the French fleet was completely destroyed, not completely, but pretty much defeated utterly by the British under the command of Horatio Nelson. It was one of the great naval victories in British history. So basically, Napoleon knew that an invasion of Great Britain was off the table. So as early as 1806, when he was occupying Berlin, he came up with what he called the Continental System. The idea was to put on a huge embargo, to close all the ports of Europe from British trade. And as a result, the British, because of they relied on trade for their economy, his thinking was that eventually this huge blockade would result in the British coming to terms. But what the British did instead, they weren't going to stand down. They imposed a counter-blockade. So they began to put a blockade on ships trading with the French or their allies. Now, eventually, this brought the United States into the war, even though the United States never allied with France, but as a result of the British seizing American ships who were trading with the French, eventually this was one of the causes of the War of 1812. In fact, one of the reasons why in American history the War of 1812 the Americans enjoyed some success in this war was because during most of this war, the British were occupied with the war against Napoleon, and most of the battles that were fought, at least until the very end, most of the battles that were fought during the War of 1812 featured American forces fighting Canadian militia, which were basically not that good. Or, well, basically the strength of the British during the War of 1812 were their Indian allies like Tecumseh and the Shawnee, who did most of the fighting during the War of 1812. But now Napoleon, though, in order to impose and to establish this kind of blockade, what he ended up doing was committing overreach. This is what tyrants do. They commit themselves too much to something, and this turns out to be an overreach, and that exposes them and creates their eventual downfall. And that's what you see happening in the case of Napoleon. He, for example, he overstressed himself in one way. He wanted to knock out Denmark and Sweden. He didn't want them trading with the British. So in 1807 and 1808, French forces occupied Sweden and Denmark. In fact, he imposed a new king on Sweden. One of his generals and his former brother-in-law, Bernadette, he made him in 1810 king of Sweden. The funny thing about Bernadette is that even after Napoleon fell, he ingratiated himself with the Swedish nobility, and they continued to recognize him as their king afterwards. And he eventually changed his name to Charles, or Karl, and he became Charles XIV. And in fact, the constitutional monarchs of Sweden today are all descended from Bernadette, a French general whose father was an innkeeper. He was just a commoner. But anyway, so, but then, also, in addition to occupying Sweden and Denmark, he occupied Portugal and Spain because he wanted to control these areas. In fact, these have an impact on events in the New World. In 1808, when he occupied Portugal, for example, the king of Portugal went into exile and declared himself the Emperor of Brazil, and that's when Brazil became an independent country. It was ruled by the branch of the ruling family of Portugal. He got rid of the Bourbons of Spain and imposed his brother Joseph as the king of Spain, and one of his generals, Murat, he made him his viceroy in Naples in southern Italy. So he was rearranging the chairs after he had made this occupation happen. But you see, the thing about Spain and Portugal was that the Spanish and the Portuguese did not like the French, and so they fought a guerrilla war against the French occupiers. And it's known as the Peninsular War because the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal, and eventually the English sent forces under one of their greatest generals, Arthur Wellesley, also known as the Duke of Wellington. And so with English support, what Napoleon found himself facing was fighting a guerrilla war against the Portuguese and the Spanish, who were being aided by the English. And this tied down a lot of his troops in the Iberian Peninsula, in Spain and Portugal. Now, it was at this time that eventually, seeing that that he was really busy, that Francis II, the Habsburg Emperor, he decided that now was the time to break free from his alliance that he'd been forced to sign in 1805, but it didn't work. So Napoleon sent in troops, and he ended up taking away from the Habsburg Empire what is today Croatia and Slovenia, and calling them the Illyrian provinces. And he even forced, after defeating Francis II, he even forced Francis II to give him his eldest daughter in marriage. Now that's humiliating, because they always used to call the Habsburgs had nothing but contempt for Napoleon, because he was just, from their point of view, even though he was, of course, he was an aristocrat in Corsica. That's like being the best dressed guy in Omaha, Nebraska. I mean, he was a nobody. And so the idea that the Habsburg Emperor, the greatest dynasty in Europe, would give their eldest daughter as the wife and queen of Napoleon, that was just very humiliating. But Maria Louise was married, and she actually loved him. They actually had Napoleon wasn't a very good husband. He was very adulterous. He bragged that he slept with over 2,000 women. I mean, now he might have been lying, but men tend to brag about these things. But anyway, who knows? But but she apparently they had a relationship. It wasn't like she actually liked him, even though she was half his age. She was like a young girl, and he was hitting middle age by this point. Now eventually though, Russia decided they've had enough. They don't want to be allies with this guy. So what happened is by 1812, it looked like Alexander and Russia were defying more and more Napoleon. And so this is where Napoleon made his gravest mistake. He decided that it was time to teach Russia a lesson. So he put together an army of almost 500,000 men. Now most of these men were draftees. Most of them were not French. By this time, the French were kind of running low on manpower because of all this long series of wars. So most of his army were made up of draftees who didn't really want to be there. But so that was a mistake, because there wasn't a lot of unity among the army. And then he also made the mistake of invading Russia in the wintertime.
Why does everyone do that?
What?
Why does everyone do that?
Well, he thought that he could just get in there, it'd be a quick battle, a quick campaign, wipe out the Russians, and they would surrender. But what happened is that the Russians, it's called the scorched earth policy. The Russians just retreated and destroyed everything in their way as they retreated. And so Napoleon, as he advanced into Russia, he couldn't just live off the land because all the land had been destroyed, everything in his path. So he had to extend his supply lines, and that made it so that his soldiers suffered from shortfalls. They didn't have enough food, they didn't have enough clothing, because they had this long extended supply line because the Russians had destroyed everything in his path. Now eventually he did occupy Moscow, but the Russians burned their own city. So by the time he occupied Russia, he occupied a city that had been burned to the ground by the Russians. So he was denied use by the Russians of any of the resources that were in the land. So he was completely dependent on these overextended supply lines. Well then, the Russian winter came with a fury, one of the coldest winters. They didn't have such a cold winter until 1941, when the Nazis invaded. But they had this huge cold winter, and that just took a toll on the Russians. So by the time Napoleon got his butt out of there, he did lose almost his entire army, because most of his losses were due to cold and to lack of food. So most of his army either froze to death or starved to death. So after this humiliating defeat, the Russians, the British, the Prussians, and Austria, Russia, Great Britain, Prussia, and Austria, they got together, they got their act together, and they organized the Quadruple Alliance, the Alliance of Four. That's what quadruple means. So the Alliance of Four was formed. The great powers, Russia, Great Britain, Prussia, and Austria, they combined forces, unified their commands, and they all just went after Napoleon. Now, at the Battle of Leipzig in 1813, that was the first. It was fought in Germany. That was the first defeat that Napoleon suffered. Now, by this time, he had a problem with filling up the ranks. France had been bled dry. They were finding it difficult to find new troops to fill the ranks because of all these long wars. And then eventually, by early 1814, with Allied armies threatening to invade France itself, Napoleon finally abdicated the throne, and Louis XVIII, the younger brother of Louis XVI, Louis XVII had been starved to death as a boy by the French Revolution. But Louis XVIII, the younger brother of Louis XVI, came to the throne, and Napoleon went into exile. Now, he initially went into exile on the island of Elba, which is just off the coast of Italy. But he figured that there was still some support, especially among the army and among his veterans, for him. So in early 1815, after he'd only been in exile for less than a year, in early 1815 he came back to France, and his veterans rallied behind him. One thing about Napoleon was that his troops loved him, and his men loved him. They just thought the world of him. So when he showed up in 1815, it showed up on French soil, all of his old veterans, they all rallied behind him. And he soon had an army under his command, and he kicked out Louis XVIII, and for a while, called the 100 Days, he was once again the Emperor of France. So the quadruple alliance had to kick in again, and they decided to invade France. The big battle was fought in what is today Belgium. Belgium is the borderland between Germany and France in a lot of ways. But at the Battle of Waterloo, for the second time, only the second time in his career, Napoleon faced a major defeat. So Leipzig and Waterloo at the very end of his career were the only two major defeats that Napoleon ever suffered. But after Waterloo, after he was defeated at the Battle of Waterloo, he once again abdicated the throne. But this time, he went into exile, not to Elba, but St. Helena, which is off the coast of Africa. They wanted to make sure that he was really far away. Now, they could have killed him, but actually his wife, the daughter of the Habsburg Empress, she kind of liked him. And they had had a son by this time, little Napoleon II. Little Napoleon. And so they showed him some mercy. So he ended up being sent into exile. And believe it or not, he did not die until 1830. So he spent the last 15 years of his life living on a tropical island off the coast of Africa with every of his needs being met. Boy, that must have been tough. And that must have been really tough for him to live on that island and have everything at his beck and call on a tropical island. Tough. I bet he probably happy as a lark. Who knows? Now, there are two versions of his death. One version of his death has him pining away for his lost days as emperor. The other version of his death is that he was happy. Living the life, giving a tequila. I don't know. But anyway, so that's Napoleon. All right, so we've ran out of time today. What we're going to see next time is in the 19th century there are these waves of revolutions because you can't keep a revolution down. And so even though
your conference is scheduled to end in 2 minutes.
Even though Napoleon thought they defeated Napoleon, the ideas of the French Revolution continued.